ID into a Ruby on Rails application the Polar Notion way. First, we're going to start off by creating a fresh project and only focus on friendly ID. So the project name is going to be gem install friendly ID, and we're going to spin it up. So Rails new gem install friendly ID. Alright, and no issues here, so I'm going to change into the directory gem install friendly ID. Awesome. Now that I'm in, I'm going to take a look, and the project was successfully created. I'm going to set up my initial commit. Try to keep this consistent. There we go. Cool. So now I am on master and good to go to start setting up friendly ID. Here's the documentation, and I'm going to go down to the usage section. Some gems will call it install, others usage, and then others whatever they like. So we are going to actually grab this gem declaration here and open up friendly ID and add that to our gem file, again adding it just above the development test group. After we install gems, as always, we're going to run bundle install. Install is a default bundle action, and so bundle will suffice. And I can see here that they've fetched and installed friendly ID version 5. Awesome. What friendly ID does is it creates really prettier URLs. So as we can see here with GitHub, right? There's the username, and there is the repo name. Friendly ID will allow us to do that in our application as well. The way that they do that is by looking for, or the way that it does that is by looking for this idea of a slug. And a slug is the part that comes after the top level domain. And so we want to actually save a slug attribute onto each object that we want to have this friendly ID or this pretty URL. Before we do that, we are actually going to generate the friendly ID setup. This is a step that if you're just reading through this documentation thinking, oh, I'm just going to add a slug to something, which they're using as users here, it's not actually going to work, because friendly ID, in order to make sure that if you change a slug later, you can still find the path in your application, it's actually going to build a database table that tracks that. And so you can, on a given object, use just the current slug or pull from its entire slug history. And the gem is going to handle that for you. So we want to definitely make sure that we generate friendly ID. Big step here. So Rails generate friendly ID, and what we're going to see is that a file is created for us, a migration here, and also an initializer. So let's go take a look at that initializer first. Again, for these types of initializers, they have some really good defaults, so I tend to not do too much with them. Usually what I'm looking for is just making sure something hasn't changed. One important note, though, is you'll see that they have reserved words. And so these are words that friendly ID will not create slugs with them, right? That's really protecting the integrity of your application and making sure that they're not going to step on the toes of Rails defaults. So let's say you didn't want people to be able to create slugs with other words, you can add that here, and they're just not going to do that. I think the most recent version will actually append like a long string to the end of it. So if you try to create a slug with the word new, it would say new dash blah, 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 right, and have a bunch of stuff afterwards. Again, tend to not touch this too much, but from time to time a client will have an opinion about a word that should or shouldn't be used, and so this is where you would edit that. But what we all came here for was in this database migration. So we can see that so we're creating a table here. Sluggable, this is what's called a polymorphic association, so that you can append this idea of a slug to many things, and it's creating a bunch of indexes so that we can query it really quickly. Also, what's a new addition to friendly ID as of Rails 5 is you have to actually declare the version in the migration, and so this little migration class has been added depending on the version of Rails that you're using. So if I tried to migrate without this, or if you're using kind of a more outdated version from the ID, it will likely break on Rails 5, but this has been added. So that's awesome. So I'm going to come in here, rake db migrate. Awesome. And then now when I come into my DB schema, I can see that the table has been successfully created for friendly ID. Awesome. So that is in place. I've migrated that. And now when it comes to using it, right? We have to call friendly ID, which is going to bring in a bunch of other logic for us. And then we get to pick which attribute we want to convert into the slug. So in the example here, the user has a name, and so friendly ID is going to be looking for that name attribute, and then convert whatever's in the name field into a slug. So we're going to actually do that for ourselves. So let's commit really quickly. All right, so we are up to date. Here we can see that our initial commit plus friendly ID, just like to do some sanity checks every once in a while. Also, kind of as a part of a good discipline, and I'm about to move into a different task, I'm gonna just close things down so that I have a nice clean slate. And what I'm gonna do here is generate a scaffold for, let's use the idea of a project, and a project's going to have a name, and it's also, because we have friendly ID, and we wanna put a slug attribute. If this data type was an integer, I would have to define that here so that the migration is built correctly, but string is a default value, name and slug are both strings, and so this, this command is pretty simple. So Rails generate project, name and slug. Rails did what it does, and so now if I go in here into the migrations, my second migration, I can see projects that have a name as a string and a slug, which is exactly what I wanted. So I can run rake db migrate to persist that to the database. Great. And then I'm going to spin up a server so I can actually take a look at this in a browser. Oops, deleted that S there. Awesome. So here are my projects. There's nothing there, so let's go ahead and create one. I'm going to leave slug empty for now just to show you. Gem install video. I'm going to press create. Now, you'll notice that a slug did not get created for me. And that's because I have not actually told friendly ID to build that slug. So if I come over here and open up my models and find that project model, I'm going to go ahead and put this in place. Now remember, if you didn't call it, if you're not trying to build it off of a name and trying to build it off of something else, you will want to update this. Seems obvious, but you'd be surprised. So when I go to my project now, and I'm going to go back to build a new project, and let's call this second attempt. Now if I leave slug empty, it's actually not working, which is odd. Let's try this one more time. Use slugged project. Third attempt. You know, just out here coding in the wild. There's an off chance that I may need to restart my server, which would be odd. But fourth attempt. All right, let's troubleshoot this together. This is kind of strange. Table. I'm going to just go through, open up a new tab since I got my server running. I already ran rake migrate, but I can keep running this and it's not going to migrate if nothing else is there. I'm going to shut down my server and run bundle one more time just to make sure that's good. Okay, and then I'm going to, let's hard refresh. let's go back. It might actually be because it thinks I'm trying to pass in a slug because that field is there. So what I'm going to do, just for simplicity, is I'm going to remove this so it doesn't try and pass in an empty value. So fifth, this is without slug in view, create. This is a good problem. So what you can see here is that it actually tried to redirect me to the correct location. But one thing that you'll note in the documentation, if I keep moving down, is actually in my controller need to replace .find with .friendly.find. The reason is because if I go and look at my controller by default, it is going to have project.find, which is looking for the ID. But as you can see in our example here, we don't have a number anymore. We have the slug. And so .friendly.find will essentially superimpose the slug with the ID. And so now when I come back, it will actually allow my slug to serve as the ID for this route. And so, yeah, that's an important distinction there, making sure to remove that slug, because again, I'm passing, essentially the application thought I was passing in a slug, it was just empty, and so it didn't build one for me. But what I want it to do is actually construct that. And let's say I wanted to be able to edit it but not create it. I could wrap this in some conditional logic. If project ID.present, so I'm only want to show this if project ID is present. Pardon me, I'm not as familiar with ERB. Haml is the default polar notion markup. So if I edit, I can see it here, but if I go to create a new project, it is gone. So nice little way of, if you wanted to update the slug, but you didn't want it to break on the initial build, and making sure that you add friendly.find to your controller. Otherwise, if it works, it's actually going to look broken, which is not what we want. Usually with any gem, I would just do a final glance at everything else. One thing that you'll have here is, let's say you add friendly ID into an existing application that didn't previously have slugs. It has this pretty simple update command that you can run so that then it would build slugs on any existing objects. We're not going to get into that today, but that's a little neat tool. In most cases, friendly ID should already be installed because we usually want to keep our URLs clean from the beginning. So there you have it, installing friendly ID the polar notion way, with a little glimpse at some fixing stuff on the fly.